A powerful superpower sent its army into a neighboring country, expecting to stabilize the situation, support an allied government, and leave. But instead of a fast victory, it got pulled into a long, exhausting war that dragged on for nearly a decade. Mountains became battlefields, villages turned into war zones, and what started as a controlled mission slowly turned into a costly and complex conflict that would reshape global politics. So what really happened in the Soviet-Afghan War? Why did the Soviet Union get involved in the first place? And when it finally ended, who actually lost? To understand this war, we need to go back to the late 1970s. Afghanistan at the time was going through major political changes. In 1978, a communist government came to power after a coup known as the Saur Revolution. This new government introduced radical reforms, land redistribution, changes in education, and efforts to reduce traditional power structures. But these changes were not accepted easily. Many people in rural areas resisted the reforms. Religious leaders, tribal groups, and local communities saw them as a threat to their traditions and way of life. Protests and uprisings began to spread across the country. The government struggled to maintain control. At the same time, internal divisions within the ruling party made the situation even more unstable. The Soviet Union, which supported the Afghan government, became increasingly concerned. It feared that if the government collapsed, Afghanistan could move out of its sphere of influence, especially during the Cold War, when global competition between superpowers was intense. In December 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan. Their goal was to stabilize the government and secure their influence in the region. They quickly took control of key cities and installed a leadership more aligned with their interests. At first, it looked like the Soviets had the upper hand. They had a well-equipped military, modern weapons, and control over major urban centers. But controlling cities was only part of the challenge. Much of Afghanistan is made up of rugged mountains and rural areas, terrain that is difficult for conventional armies to dominate. And this is where the real war began. Opposition fighters, known as the Mujahideen, organized resistance against the Soviet forces and the Afghan government. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and deep knowledge of the terrain. This was not a traditional war with clear front lines. Instead, it was a slow, grinding conflict where Soviet forces struggled to identify and defeat an enemy that could appear and disappear quickly. The war also attracted international attention. The United States, along with other countries, began supporting the Mujahideen. This support included funding, weapons, and training. For the US, this was part of a larger Cold War strategy to counter Soviet influence without direct confrontation. Other countries in the region also became involved in different ways, turning the conflict into a proxy war. As the years passed, the situation became more difficult for the Soviet Union. Despite their military strength, they were unable to fully control the countryside. Supply lines were constantly threatened. Troops faced not only combat but also harsh environmental conditions. The human costs began to rise. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or wounded. Afghan civilians suffered even more, with large numbers displaced from their homes. Villages were destroyed and infrastructure was damaged. Back in the Soviet Union, public opinion started to shift. The war was becoming unpopular. It was expensive, both in terms of money and human lives. Many people began to question why the country was involved in such a distant and difficult conflict. By the mid-1980s, it became clear that the war was not going to end quickly. A new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, described the conflict as a bleeding wound. He began looking for a way out. Negotiations started and plans were made for withdrawal. In 1989, Soviet troops officially left Afghanistan. But the end of the Soviet presence did not mean the end of the conflict. Afghanistan continued to face internal fighting for years afterward. So now comes the big question. Who actually lost? In one level, the Soviet Union did not achieve its main objectives. It failed to create long-term stability in Afghanistan and could not secure a lasting friendly government. The war drained resources, damaged its international image, and contributed to internal problems that would eventually lead to its collapse in 1991. So from that perspective, the Soviet Union clearly paid a heavy price. But the story does not end there. Afghanistan also suffered deeply. The war left the country devastated. Millions of people were displaced. Infrastructure was destroyed. The conflict weakened the state and created conditions for further instability in the years that followed. The Mujahideen, who fought against the Soviets, achieved their immediate goal of resisting foreign intervention. But after the Soviets left, different factions began fighting amongst themselves, leading to more conflict and eventually the rise of new groups. So while one side withdrew and another resisted, the long-term outcome was far more complicated. This is what makes the Soviet-Afghan War difficult to define in simple terms of victory or defeat. The Soviet Union failed to win the war it started. Afghanistan endured massive destruction, and the global powers involved achieved some short-term goals but also contributed to long-term instability in the region. The war is often compared to other conflicts where a stronger military struggled against local resistance in difficult terrain. It showed that even a superpower can face limits when fighting in unfamiliar conditions against a determined opponent. Looking back, the Soviet-Afghan War was more than just a Cold War conflict. It was a turning point. It exposed weaknesses in the Soviet system, influenced global power dynamics, and left a lasting impact on Afghanistan that is still felt today. So when we ask who actually lost, the answer isn't simple. Because in a war like this, where destruction spreads across a country and its people, and where long-term consequences continue for decades, the idea of a clear winner becomes harder and harder to find.